That should be available on our website afterwards. Along with, I believe, there are 2 or 3 of these up there already from previous weeks. So if you're interested in those, they should also be available. But yeah, as I said, what we're going to do is going to wait a couple more minutes, make sure everyone who wants to be here manages to get in, and then we'll kick off at 2 or 3 minutes past.
Matt, you need to let Rohan and I share our video.
All right, I think we're just about ready to get going. I'm going to let Will and Rohan show their faces now, which they've been complaining about. Let me see.
So we've actually reached the limit for the 100.
Oh wow! Yeah, so we're
gone up.
Yeah, this is more popular than we were prepared for. There's now we're now bumping up against the limit of people. I can't figure out how to let you both be video, which is frustrating.
Okay, well, let's get started, and people will have to make do without our beautiful faces.
Well, let's start with mine for now, which unfortunately is the least beautiful. Fab. Okay, well, I'll try and figure that one out later on. Aha, no, I think you can turn your video on now. Fab. I think I'm in it. Perfect. All right. So, hello everyone. Thank you for coming along. There are exactly 100 of you, which is the most there's allowed to be. So this is by default our most popular ever of these Open Day webinars, which is exciting. And until we, I don't know, investigate to see if we can up the limit to 1,000, it will remain the most popular one. So you can say you were here on the famous day. So to let you know who you're hearing from today, you've got 3 of us here, myself, Matt, Will and Rohan. Here are some lovely pictures of us. And if you'd like to introduce yourselves, Will and Rohan.
Yeah, shall I kick off?
Sure.
So yeah, I've been looking through the participants. Some of you I've already spoken with. I'm sort of the senior admission consultant here at UniAdmissions. So, you know, I've also may have spoken with a number of your children as well about their applications. Hopefully I'll be very helpful in the Q&A part of this, but for people with very specific questions and scenarios that they want to talk about, please do arrange a consultation, and you know, we'll be very happy to chat with you over the next couple of weeks about it.
Yeah, thanks, Will. My name is Dr. Rohan Agrawal. So my background is I studied medicine at Cambridge and then founded UniAdmissions several years ago. I'm currently the managing director and look after our consulting teams. My role is to essentially speak to parents, students, make sure they're getting their top tier advice, and to ensure that we continue providing world-leading programs and ensuring that we get at least 2/3 of our students in and keep improving our success rates year after year.
So that's those guys, the real stars. My name's Matt. I look after our research here at UniAdmissions, which involves a lot of work with Will and Rohan and with other sources, making sure that all the advice we're able to give you is the most up-to-date and the most effective and actionable that it can be. So I'll talk you through a little bit of the work I've been doing recently in a second. But as Will mentioned, if you'd like to speak to us directly, whether that's to have some particularly personal queries addressed or anything else, if you visit the website, you can arrange a consultation with Will or Rohan or one of the other members of the team, and they'll be able to answer your questions and give you a taste of the services that are available. And I think, Rohan, you're going to talk very briefly now about our medicine interview program that we have available at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So after every single one of these webinars, we get kind of flooded with parents and students kind of wondering what they can do to improve their chances. Obviously, if you're applying for medicine now or any other Oxbridge subject, you should have sat your admissions test. The next step really, and the key component that remains, is the interview. We'll talk a lot about interview preparation during this discussion, but the common thing that I get parents asking is, how can we start preparing, or we'll start preparing once we've heard back? To give you all context, Oxford and Cambridge are notorious for giving about sometimes as little as 5 days. These are soft skills and they take a long time to improve. So hopefully your children have already been preparing for this, but if they haven't, they need to start now rather than in 3 weeks' time or 4 weeks' time. Soft skills take a long time to develop, and it's not fair to expect them to suddenly be good at interviews. Unless your children have gone through several interviews, they're unlikely to have a good understanding of what's required. So regardless of whether you work with us, whether you work with a company at all, please make sure at the end of this, they get started this weekend, because that's very essential. The way we work with students coming to us fairly late in the day is we put them onto our focused medical interview programs. So essentially they'll get 4 mock interviews, all with different individuals who've studied their subjects. So for instance, someone applying to Cambridge Medicine would have 4 mock interviews with students and graduates who've studied medicine at Cambridge and Oxford. And then in addition, they'll have 4 hours of individual tutoring. Essentially what that does is it allows them to make whatever they've learned from their interviews, put that into practice, and review the key learning points, and of course, go through commonly asked questions and topics. And then the final bit is placed in our interview courses. So students can't book onto these individually. That needs to be done as part of the program. You're probably wondering why, and that's because in our experience, it takes significant time and effort. So in the past, we've had students turn up to these courses and think that that's the end of their interview preparation. Actually, that's the start of it. And we're very honest with students and parents that actually take significant time and experience to actually see a significant improvement in interview performance ultimately. So by doing this, we see some very good results. Last year, we got more than 2/3 of our students into Oxbridge. We got more than half of our students into medicine for Oxbridge as well. So what we do does work, but obviously it's not a magic bullet. We'll kind of crack on, Mac. But if you do have more questions, please do feel free to get in touch and obviously ask as many questions on the chat as we go along.
Yeah, thanks, Rohan. So just to run you through a little bit quickly, the work we've been doing so far this year. This year we've worked with over 250 students. They've been working with over 1,300 tutors, which gives us a staff to student ratio of 5 staff to 1 student, which we're very proud of. And across all of our approaches to teaching and learning, we're coming up for, I think, 6,000 hours of study in total. Obviously that number is hopefully changing at this very moment, with students starting to prepare for their interviews after their admissions tests last week. Some of the things that I've been particularly proud of have been our ongoing research into the process. We've been able to attend online open days for both Oxford and Cambridge. We've been able to open up new sources of freedom of information data, which has allowed us to update all of our written resources in line with the latest admissions test changes. So if you were revising from one of our books last week for a test, those will all have been absolutely up to date. And we're also, we've also been providing support for students working on computer-based exams, which is something we're going to talk about in a moment. So to give you a flavour of these things, that's we've been able to gather together information on the average GCSEs of all Cambridge applicants. which allows us to really give contextual data to students and parents when they come to speak to us. And we also found this marvelous little clip from an interviewer in English at Cambridge on the value of extracurricular activities that I always like to share with parents as we're getting towards the interview stage.
I suppose if you are extremely interested and excited by things that are not related to the subject of English, like sport or music or something like that, that's great. But we're probably not that interested actually in that element of your well-rounded self.
I always like to share that just as reassurance that if you didn't do your Gold Duke of Edinburgh award, it's probably not going to matter. Now, that brings us on to our kind of model of how the application process works. Rohan, is this something you'd be happy to pick up on for a moment?
Sure, Matt. So we often get students coming to us, particularly earlier in the year, and asking us, what's the most important thing? Can you look at my personal statement? Have I got enough work experience? All of those things. The key thing to mention here at this point is Oxford and Cambridge are completely different to how most other universities will assess you. So it depends on the course and the university you're applying to, but in general, the way we like to think is 30% of your score is given to your exam grades. 30% is given to your interview score, and then 30% is given to your admissions test. 10%, it's kind of shown in yellow here, is for everything else. So essentially your personal statement, your UCAS reference, any extracurriculars that you mention, they all go into that small yellow segment. Now, the grey segment is hopefully already been sorted, and the blue segment, which is the exam grades and the test scores, are all sorted. Sorry, I beg your pardon. The grey and the orange. The only thing really remains now, in most people's cases, is the interview, and that's what's the most important that we need to focus on. So loads of students will kind of worry about their tests and interviews. Actually, if you've done the test, there's not much else you can do at this stage. So you need to move on and really start preparing for the interview. The key thing to mention is Cambridge will interview significantly more students than Oxford, so that's also something to keep in mind.
Yeah, as Rohan says, obviously the interview is the last thing. You can do as well as you like up until the interview, but you have the, it's the decisive moment, right? So the question that a lot of people come to us with is, will I be invited to interview or not? This is obviously very stressful, answering this question, and we can't guarantee an interview for anyone or perfectly predict. But what we do have is quite good information, particularly from Oxford, about the rates at which they invite students to interview. So your chances of getting an interview depend almost entirely on which course and which university. If you can imagine a subject that has 200 applicants for 100 places, it's fairly straightforward to interview almost all of those. But if there are 2,000 applicants for 100 places, then that certainly isn't practical, because that's an awful lot of people you've got to move around. So Oxford, they interview around 93% of applicants for chemistry. And this is in part because chemistry doesn't have an admissions test. Whereas for computer science, they'll only interview around 11% of applicants, which is because computer science is such a popular and competitive course. Now, Cambridge will interview almost everyone who applies for medicine, and Rohan will speak a little bit about this later, I'm sure, whereas Oxford only interviews around a quarter of applicants. So if you've got an interview for Cambridge medicine, that's great, but chances are you haven't improved your chances all that much yet, whereas at Oxford, you've made a big step towards getting a place if you've made it to the interview. Now, we don't have as much detail on Cambridge as we would like, and that's because they don't provide information publicly about who they do and they don't interview. And that's because they interview between 70 and 90% of applicants, depending on the subject. And so they argue that there isn't a legitimate public interest in it being public data, which is annoying, but not something I've been able to convince them of yet. And all of this information is based on students who applied in 2019 and have just started in the last few weeks. So this is the most accurate up-to-date information we have. So what are the interviews like? Obviously, they're all taking place online this year. I'm still trying to find out which suite of software they're going to be on, whether it's going to be on Zoom or on Teams or on Bramble or on something else. At the moment I know that, I'm sure we'll have a webinar about the technical aspects of getting used to the software for everyone, which I think will be really helpful. We know that Oxford, they've already released the dates, and so their interviews are going to be starting on the 7th of December and running for about 2 weeks from there on. Obviously, once we get to the 20th of December or so, they'll all be going home for Christmas or staying at home for Christmas, as is the case for most people. We still haven't had confirmation of the dates from Cambridge. Normally they are at roughly the same time. So that's what we would expect, that they'll be running from the beginning of December. And non-Oxbridge medical interviews for places like Kiel or Southampton or King's, those should be coming up in the next couple of weeks as well. Have you heard anything more about those, Rohan?
I think there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly now there's a lockdown that's come in. We're monitoring the information that's been given now, but I think universities are scrambling a little bit to kind of catch up and give more updated information. So the UCAT scores were only sent out to universities earlier last week, so we anticipate it'll still be a few weeks before they start making interview invites.
Yeah, the virus has disrupted all sorts of things. And one of the dangers I expect is that since people aren't having to travel for these events, it may be tempting for the universities to be a little more short notice than they would otherwise have been, which is frustrating for everyone involved. Now, Will and Rohan will be able to offer more concrete information on this next station of how the interviews work, because not only did I do mine now, I believe 12 years ago, so my personal experience is a little out of date. I also didn't get into Oxford when I first tried, so my experience isn't perhaps the best it could be. But what we do know is that the interviews themselves are much more structured and strict than you might think. If you sort of come to us with the fear that it's going to be, you know, all kinds of wacky questions, you know, they tell me about a banana kind of thing, that really doesn't tend to go on anymore. There's a real emphasis on things being continuously audited, things being fair, and the whole process being transparent and clear. So you can be confident that nothing really wacky is going to come up, even if you have heard those stories. Rohan or Will, in fact we'll have Will, won't we? Because we've heard from Rohan. Will, can you tell us a little bit about your interview experience?
Yeah, sure. So generally, I sort of, based on my experience, and obviously this is a bit subject specific, I sort of split the interviews into two parts. One which is a measure of fluid intelligence, and one which is a measure of interest within and around your subject and academic curiosity. And they test these things in two ways. Typically, for psychologists at least, the admissions tutor at each college would pick a scenario or a set of questions or a research paper that they would go through with every student. They typically purposefully choose something that the student won't be familiar with. So they're, you know, when I applied, my teachers told me that I had to be familiar with everything. That's not the point. That they're actively trying to find something that you won't know, to see how you're able to handle that information, how you tackle it, how well you're able to, if it's a research paper, read it critically, and, you know, analyze what was good, what was wrong about it. If it's a sort of a thought experiment, you know, how would we study for X, or how would we test for X? If it's a new variable, how do you design your experiment accordingly? Now that, like I say, so that was the first half of my interview. And it's not, you know, when we work on interviews with students, it's not about preparing a set of pre-learned responses to a set of tricky questions. That's probably the best way to end up doing pretty badly in the interview. And of course, you can't prepare for absolutely every unknown scenario. But what you can do is get much more comfortable with handling this new information, being able to work through things collaboratively with the tutor as well, because they will build on the questions that they ask. It's very, very rarely is it one question, one answer, then on to the next question, next answer. It's usually a 5, 10, 15-minute discussion about the whole topic. And then the second part of the interview, the more academic curiosity side of things, that certainly is something that you can work on. And now, lots of schools will be telling you to read as many books as you can, read all the books on the suggested reading list, those kind of things. That's not bad advice. It's not fantastic. Generally speaking, I say that the number of books that you read should be a side effect rather than the main goal. Okay, you should have read a large number of books because you've been exploring a subject that you enjoy and specific niche areas which you've wanted to learn more about. And the outcome of that is that you've made your way through quite a few books. They don't look at you, they don't read your personal statement and say, well, you've read 50 books on psychology or on engineering, so that means you're a good applicant. It's a side effect rather than the main thing that you're aiming for. And I also tell students it's much better to read into a few topics to a really deep level so that you actually understand it very well, and could talk about it with one of the tutors in your interview, rather than learning lots and lots of things at a peripheral level, at a superficial level. Because again, that's what someone who is very interested in their subject would do. And it can be easy to be carried away by reading lists about things that you don't care about, you're not interested in. Most of these subjects represent a broad field, so broad that you could spend a whole lifetime in it without touching certain topics. So to think that you have to suddenly be understand all topics in your subject area is, well, it's certainly going to take up a lot of time, and it's not necessarily going to turn you into a good interviewee. So yeah, those are the two things that I tell students to bear in mind, that they're measuring how you can handle new information and your academic curiosity and interest. That was quite a long-winded answer.
No harm in that. I say we're always keen to make sure we can give people the as much detail and expertise as we can in these webinars. And so if that means a long answer, then all the better. So when we were looking at the interview, because we've had a couple of people asking about soft skills in the chat. So if you look at some of the documents that Oxford and Cambridge produced to guide interviewers, these are the three kind of categories of soft skill that I've been able to find in my research. So the first one is application. So they were looking for students who can really concentrate, who show passion and enthusiasm and really attack the problems that they're given in the interview. They're looking for students who can reason, that they react thoughtfully, they have arguments that are clear and subtle but free of contradictions, and that if they find themselves going down a rabbit hole of ideas that isn't very interesting or very useful, they know how to stop and get out of it. And most importantly, that when they communicate, that everything is clear and articulate and careful and thoughtful. Now, the challenge here, of course, is that everyone's going to have to do all of this over Zoom or Bramble or Skype or Microsoft Teams or whatever it turns out to be, which is a much harder challenge. Now, this is something I've been spending some time looking into. And so there are a few tips I can share with you, which hopefully I'm managing to succeed with. The first is to look into the camera, not into the screen, something I find very difficult. It will make it look like you are looking at the person, whereas if you do this, it feels much less engaging than if you do this. It takes a bit of practice, but it does pay off. It helps to dress properly, even out of shot. It might be tempting to wear tracksuit trousers or no trousers or football shorts. Probably a bad idea. Maybe even try out wearing shoes to see if that helps, just so it feels like a real meeting. Make sure you take your time, be clear and articulate, and remember that there's a delay associated with everything being online. And so it's even more important than it would be in person to be clear. Remember as well that you don't really have any body language. So anything that might be a little too subtle in the way you present yourself, you can amp up a little bit and really push yourself through the camera to show people that you're interested. Again, feels a little bit weird, but I think it's worth a go. And the other thing to say is make sure the interviewer can actually see you. So make sure you have a setup with some good lighting and that you've tested it beforehand to make sure that it looks fine. One tactic that I'm looking to try out myself over the next few weeks is to buy a special light to sit here just above the laptop to improve the lighting of my face. If that turns out to work well, I'll recommend that to everyone else. Maybe it'll look silly, but I thought that might be worth a go. And so that brings on to how can we help? And Rohan, this is back to you again, talking about our interventions. I mean, it's the example we've got is medicine again, but if you could speak a little more broadly about how we can help, people who don't want to be doctors.
So thanks, Matt. The program and the way it's structured ensures that you'll get about 6 mock interviews throughout the whole process. In our experience, that's sufficient to get a better understanding of the application process and what the actual interview will look like on the day. Regardless of which subject you're applying for, you'll be interviewed by specialists in that subject. So for instance, if you're applying for PPE, your 4 mock interviews would be structured so you'd have 1 in philosophy, 1 in politics, 1 in economics, and 1 on your personal statement. That's a very standard structure for the 4 mock interview component. And then you'd have tutoring at the start and then towards the end of that mock interview program. In addition, what we provide is a place on one of our courses. We talked a little bit about the fact that it actually takes place over a full weekend. So it's a 2-day course. And essentially you get 2 mock interviews and about 6 hours of small group teaching. So you're always in a group. So if you're applying for medicine, you're in a group of medics. If you're applying for law, you're in with other students who are applying for law and so on. It essentially allows you to actually discuss some fairly complex and high-level topics with people who are essentially experts in their field in this. The other thing I should mention is that the success rates we see aren't due to kind of chance at this point. Students coming to us very, very late, if they're coming to us with one week to go for their interview, there's limited amounts we can do for them. Whereas if they're interested in kind of being serious with their application now, there is actually, with 4 weeks to go, 4 to 5 weeks to go till interview, there's actually a substantial amount of things you can do. But if you think about what Matt was saying earlier with soft skills, things like communication, things like expressing your answers clearly, dealing with kind of objections, all of that is very, very, it takes a significant amount of time to learn it, because unless you've been through job interviews, you're unlikely to have gone through that process. In terms of the groups themselves, we're talking about maximum 8 students normally. Sometimes they're a little bit smaller depending on the subjects. So it really depends on the exact offering and the exact student type. But the key thing is these programs do work.
Fab. Thanks, Rohan. And our broader impact over the last few years, we're really proud to have got last year 63% of the students we worked with into Oxbridge, and our rate for medicine was even higher. And that's compared with, I believe, 18% for Oxbridge as a whole and 12%, I think, for medicine. Very difficult to become a doctor, which is fortunate because it's very important, although I do understand we need more doctors, so I guess it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, maybe they need to make it easier.
Well, who knows? I'm sure we wouldn't want any drop-off in doctor quality, but that's a whole other discussion. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the kind of formal presentation bit. And now on to questions. I can see 11 open questions in the Q&A section. If you can direct your questions into there rather than into the chat, simply because it's easier to find them, that would be great. And we'll sort of start running through those those now. So first off,
so there's a question about the weighting of the PAT compared to the rest of the UCAS application for engineering. This follows the principle that Rohan was talking about, how it does vary from subject to subject, that pie chart. Generally speaking, for the more STEM-based subjects, the weighting is more heavily on things like the admissions test than it is on the personal statement. You know, they design these tests themselves. So they design them to test exactly what they're looking for in their applicants. So you can expect the PAT to play more of an impact in your sort of success than for other subjects, but also in comparison to the NGAR for Cambridge, because Cambridge will be interviewing more students. It's likely that even if you had a slightly lower NGAR score, you might still get an interview and then you're still in with a chance. Whereas if you have a slightly lower PAT score, you've got less of a chance of getting to interview. So your application chances might be cut off short.
yeah, so almost exactly 1 in 3 applicants for physics gets an interview at Oxford. And while I haven't looked directly into the correlation between the test score and interviews, I know off the top of my head that the relationship for maths is extremely strong. So I'm sure that the same goes for the PAT, which is to say, if you want to get an interview, it's good to score in the top third or thereabouts of the PAT if you really want to guarantee that.
There's a follow-up question actually about engineering interviews. So what they typically do for this is they will have a number of questions, technical questions that they ask you to solve. Sometimes they give you a list of questions to solve before going into the real interview and then more to solve when you're there. Other times it can just all be done during the interview. Again, you know, I spent very little time talking about my musical interests or my sports interests during my interview. No subject will be spending time about that. But particularly the STEM ones, like we said about the admissions test, that they are even more so interested in your technical ability. So yeah, they will be setting a list of questions for you to go through.
Emma Clarasso says, if you're not offered an interview, does it mean you're out? In that case, when are you informed? So the way it works is normally Oxford and Cambridge will send interview invites and rejections out on the same day. It will depend on the college. So what you have to think about is Oxford and Cambridge aren't kind of a single university. They all have their own personalities, and each college does things in a slightly different way and a slightly different timescale. So even though Oxford may start sending interview invites out towards the end of November, they may carry on being sent well into December. Typically, each college will send out the invites and rejections on the same day. In which case, if you are unlucky and rejected, you'll find out the same day as other students. And yeah, no one gets a place at Oxbridge without an interview. So unfortunately, if you're not invited to interview, that's the end of your application.
Thanks, Rohan. We've had a lot of questions about problems with the Bmat, with the TSA, with other admissions tests. So there was a report published on this, I think, 3 days ago by Cambridge Assessment. And what you need to do is fill in a report called the application for special consideration by the middle of next week, and that will allow you to have that added onto your application to be taken into consideration. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share the link to that article for everyone to pick up, and they can respond accordingly there. But that should cover all of those questions. We've heard quite a few horror stories of people where the questions didn't load quickly enough, or whole things disappeared into blocks of red, and other horrible things happening. And if that did happen to you, then if you reach out to Cambridge Assessment through that form, they will get it sorted out for you, and they've got all of the guidelines there. It's not something we can intervene in directly. It's something you need to do. You need to do yourself, but the guidelines are there. And judging by the number of people who've had problems, I think probably it's going to be taken into consideration for a lot of applicants, because it seems like a lot of people had a bad time with the tests, which is always the danger of doing these things online without proper rehearsals.
Yeah, the Bmat and TSA, I think in particular, went down pretty badly. There were lots of students we've heard from who said they couldn't even start the test, or that half the images or diagrams didn't load, which obviously is not great. Our general advice is, if you have been affected, please, and you're not quite sure whether you or the centre should be kind of informing them, please fill in that form, but also contact the university directly and just make them aware. But the worst what will happen is they'll say, actually, this isn't an extenuating circumstance, carry on. But if you don't ask, you don't kind of receive. So please do make that effort. It takes 10 minutes.
It says on that link that they won't change your score due to the form, but of course it's important that if none of your questions loaded and you still manage to get 50% right, it's important that Oxford or Cambridge know that. And obviously, generally the advice is, if you sat it at home, you should be applying through this form yourself. If you sat it at the centre, then it should be the centre that does it, but it's certainly worth double checking, even if you did sit at the centre, just to make sure that they are following up on it, if they haven't said anything to you yet, because like Matt said, the deadline for it is mid next week. I think they say within 5 days of having sat the test. Yeah. So we're a few days since the test now. Don't put this off. Ideally, you should be looking into this right after this, if you did have problems and that affected you.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got a couple of questions about admissions test results. When will we find out the results? So unless you specifically ask, you won't find out your results in the NGAR or the PAT or whatever. Those are just used by the university internally. You're welcome, after you've applied, to send them an email and ask them to tell you how you did, but that's not something that is routinely sent out to you, is my understanding for most of those.
I think the only one is the Bmat. They usually send out at the end of November.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah,
it tends to be the same day as Black Friday, I think.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. I remember when I did the ELAT all the way back in 2007. You had to request your score. I think it was the first year of the ELAT though, so that was different.
I usually say to students that you'll find out how well you did on the test after you know whether you've got an offer. So at that point, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, so as you said, Will, the only exception to this is the BMATs, where you will find out your result. And obviously, if you apply to more than one university, then like UCL Imperial, then you may get an interview with them, depending on your BMAT score. But for the rest of them, yeah, it becomes academic, because if you've got a year offer, most people don't care about their test scores at that point.
Yeah, it's only people who did very well on the test and then very badly in the interview who tend to get upset.
Sorry, we've got a question here talking about making up a suboptimal BMAT score with interview. I think this is relevant to quite a few people, because I've seen a few questions saying, I haven't done as well as I was hoping. It is. So if you have a BMAT score which is slightly lower than what you would want, then certainly you can impress them at interview and make up for it. But what you've got to remember is, so if you've applied to Cambridge, you're probably going to get that opportunity. If you've applied to Oxford, and it does depend on your definition of suboptimal, there's a chance that you won't get that opportunity. Obviously, your other BMAT universities much more likely to interview you because they have lower BMAT thresholds and requirements. That pie chart, you've got to remember, these are all different parts interlocking, and they're considered holistically. So for people with slightly lower GCSE grades, or slightly lower predicted grades, or slightly lower test scores, that can be made up for with the strength of the rest of the application, provided you're able to actually show up for it.
One here about natural sciences and other subjects. So there's a few questions generally about what will I get asked to interview. But that really depends on what subject you're applying for. One of the most common questions we get asked, looking at the thread, is what will happen if I'm applying for natural sciences or PPE? Will I always get asked questions on the topic that I'm applying for? So if I've done biology and chemistry, will I only get asked questions about biology and chemistry, or could I also get questions? The general rule is anything that you've studied at A-level is fair game. So for instance, when I applied for medicine, you'd think that I would have been asked purely biology or chemistry questions. Actually, I had an entire interview where I had to guess the weight of the Earth, well, not guess, calculate the weight of the Earth, which was purely because I'd done physics at A level. So please make sure that before you go into your interviews, you do take time to do your A levels. Having said that, Cambridge in particular will make a great deal of effort to ensure that you only get interviewed in subjects that actually have something to do with your core subject. So for instance, if you're applying for biological natural sciences, you're unlikely to get asked questions on economics, for instance. But anything else in your A levels is fair game.
Fab. We've had quite a few questions about when you can expect to receive the interview invites. Now, my understanding is that no one's had their interview invite yet because they've only had the admissions test information for 2 days, which probably isn't enough time to make any decisions. Now, normally they tend to go out in the last week of November, and that, I believe, is what Cambridge have indicated in terms of Cambridge law so far. But I haven't heard anything from other subjects. Have you had any indications, Will or Rohan, or if we can remember what the timings were last year?
For interviews?
Hmm.
So usually Cambridge starts a week ahead of Oxford, is what I've noticed. Usually they are sort of right at the start of December, and Oxford maybe a week behind them. Oxford also, I imagine Cambridge does the same, but Oxford generally splits it into 1 week for the scientists and 1 week for the humanities. I used to sort of help run the interviews when I was at Christchurch, and you always saw that sort of the sciences sort of came in for across 5 days and then all faded out, and then you fade in over the next week. Obviously, they won't be coming to the colleges this year, so it's a little different. But usually, I don't think they're planning anything different schedule-wise. Were you asking also about when they'd hear about the invitation?
Exactly, yeah. So do you need to be worrying for the next 3 weeks or the next 6 weeks, or how long? So
our general guide is 5 to 10 days. Is sort of the range of notice you can get for an Oxbridge interview. It's difficult to say if they're going to give more or less notice this year around. I mean, the fact that there have been complications with admissions test scores would be, could delay when they actually decide and their shortlisting process. So it may be that they do give you less notice this year. That is conjecture at the moment. We don't actually know. But yeah, it's worth assuming that you won't get much notice, because then if you do get notice, great, you're happy. If you don't, then you prepared for that anyway.
We've had a lot of questions coming in about variation between the colleges for interviews and whether it makes a difference to your chance of getting in for medicine and for PPE and for other things. So generally speaking, the colleges will be fairly well coordinated about the style and level of the interviews. And I know that particularly this year at Oxford, there are real efforts going on around that with the Tinsley Outreach Fellow and other people involved in standardising the process. Now for Cambridge, it's and for Oxford as well actually, routine that you'll be interviewed by more than one college, in which case you'll get to sample for yourself the differences. But for the most part, any differences in the competitiveness of colleges is evened out by moving students around. And the colleges themselves won't vary enormously in terms of the interview style, unless either of you have anything to contradict that.
I mean, in terms of style, it's broadly the same. My interview at Wadham, there was a research paper that I went through beforehand. My interview at Christchurch, there was no pre-reading. So there are these small differences between them. And obviously, it's purely down to Rohan was talking about earlier, the individual colleges having their own slight ways of doing things. It's purely down to how the psychology professor or the geography professor or a politics professor at that college likes to interview people and what they see as a valuable way to measure people. If they really like to see how well a student can go through a research paper, then that's what they'll use. broadly speaking, these are all important skills that an Oxbridge applicant should have. You know, you should be able to analyze a paper, you should be able to handle new information, and obviously part of the course is to help you develop those skills, so that you're not just doing it at a passing level, but at a very impressive level.
Yeah. The other thing is the format of the interview does vary depending on the college, not just in terms of whether there's a task in advance, but for instance, I went through and I had three individual interviews, so 3 times 20 minutes. Some colleges will do one very long interview of 40 minutes with 2 interviews in the same room. They've not, Oxford and Cambridge, neither of them have actually said how if they intend on doing panel interviews or one-on-one. I suspect for logistical reasons, they'll all be one-on-one this year. But again, they've just not announced things so far.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions about medicine work experience. I know this is your area of expertise, Rohan. So what kinds of work experience do you recommend? And is it a worry if you haven't been able to because of the famous virus?
Yeah, so this is really, really common. Firstly, work experience still falls into that small 10% category. So if you haven't got work experience, especially under the current circumstances, you won't be rejected. What we're looking for, what the admissions tutors really want to see when students are applying for medicine is, because it's such a long course, does the applicant actually have an understanding of what the course is going to be like, what they're signing up for? The max that you really need is a week in a primary care setting and a week in a secondary care setting. So primary care is things like GP, hospices. Secondary care is generally in a hospital setting, either in clinic or on a ward. Now, based on what's been happening, you definitely don't need work experience. What the medical schools do want to see is initiative. So for instance, there are online work experience courses completely for free. There's a few links to them on the main UniAdmissions website. What they want to see is essentially what is required, and do you have the desire to actually succeed at your subject. So please don't worry about, I've only got 1 month of work, and these are genuine questions I've had. I've only got a month of work experience, is high enough. The more important thing is, can you talk to someone about what you learned and what you did during your experience for at least 20 minutes? If you can do that, you'll be completely fine for the interview.
Thanks, Rohan. We've got a few questions about Bmat scores as well. If you could just run us through that.
Yeah, so the Bmat is, so if you've taken the Bmat already, you should hopefully have a better understanding of the scores, but if you haven't, or you're thinking about applying next year, the way it works is, it works on a scaling of 0 to 9. 5 is considered an average score, 6 is considered good, 7 is excellent, and 8 and above us essentially, and you're in the top percentile at that point. We generally ask, we generally want the students working with us who are applying for Oxbridge to be aiming for 7s and above, and students applying for Imperial and UCL and other medical schools, we want them to have scores of 6 and above. That's kind of the minimum basis that we want our students to be achieving to be sure that they're going to get through to the interview phase.
There we go. Just to run through a couple of easy ones. Someone has asked us what about chance of getting in for engineering. So that's around 20% of students get an offer for engineering. I think 17 at Cambridge, around 20 at Oxford. And we've also had a question about places for physics. So at Oxford, there are about 450 places for physics. About 14% of applicants get a place. And I've seen a question from Alison Cummins about Irish applicants. This is a little bit more nuanced, and so it's probably something worth getting in touch with us either through live chat or on the phone, either this weekend or next week, as while I know a little bit about the Irish Leaving Cert system, it is not something that I can remember the details of, and so it's something I would want to do a little bit of research into before answering any questions. So it'd be great to speak to you about that next week, but I've been able to double check how it works. We've had a few more questions about the role of the personal statement in the interview. Again, Will, do you remember how much time was spent on your personal statement in your interview? I remember In mine, it was maybe 5 or 10 minutes and was kind of just a jumping off point for the rest of the discussion. So they could find something they knew you'd be interested in and sort of warm you up with.
Yeah, so I had a few questions on the personal statement, or maybe just asking about a particular area. But it was something that I'd forgotten that I'd spoken about, actually. So it sort of took me a bit by surprise. It's certainly worth just going through everything that you've spoken about on the personal statement and making sure you're familiar with it. And if someone asks you about it, it's fresh, so you can talk about it, because it had been about 2 months between actually submitting the personal statement and doing the interview. You don't have to design a huge library of pre-decided responses for everything. You're more than welcome to, if that helps you feel more comfortable. But I would argue there's much better ways to use your time. It's just helpful to not have that moment of shock that I had when going through it. But again, it was only on pretty relevant stuff. I was asked if it was psychology's responsibility to stop genocide, which is a pretty heavy topic to do in a 10-minute conversation. I was a bit taken back by it, but I had spoken about it in my personal statement. It was part of a project that I've been doing. So if you spoke about it, be ready to speak about it some more.
Fab. Thanks, Will. Just to run through another couple of quick ones. Chris Port asks, are the modern languages courses and the chance of interview quite high? So modern languages is one of the less competitive courses at Cambridge. So yes, your chance of getting into it pretty good there. I just disappeared for a second because someone's knocking on my door. Rohan, if you can pick up.
Yeah, sure. Let's have a look.
So there's something here saying, will reading material for the interview be sent to us before the interview or not, so we can print it off beforehand? This year is obviously a little different. I don't think Oxford and Cambridge have explicitly said how they're going to be doing things like this. But let's take the example of a case, maybe for a lawyer, that they want you to read before going into it. What they would typically do is you'd go to one room, sit there for 20 minutes while you're reading it, and then move into your interview room. I imagine they'll do a virtual equivalent. So whether or not it's a matter of them showing their screen with you for 20 minutes so you can read through it, or it's a PDF that they send through to you just 20 minutes before your interview, I imagine it will be something along those lines.
Yeah, sure. There's quite a few questions on the pricing and the way we work in terms of selecting students onto the programs. Well, can you just talk us through, if someone is interested in kind of joining on, what are the next steps?
Yes, so the first step really is to have a chat with you properly about this. We put quite a lot of effort into into the support that we give. We want to make sure that we're working with students who are serious about their application and are going to be, putting in the extra hours for this. Like I say, the next step would be to have a chat. We much prefer to have a good sense as to what our students need and what is going to help them get the offers, rather than, just sort of taking on anyone. Of course, we've got the sort of focused interviews program is what we're recommending generally for students at the moment, but it may be, depending on our conversation, that something else is more relevant. And again, I'd want you to have what's more relevant rather than what's more general, because especially in this last month, you've got to make sure that you're working on the things that you need to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. And Will's really right there. So you'll have noticed actually it's impossible to buy anything from the main website, and that's because we want to speak to, unlike other providers and companies, we want to speak to every single student before we accept them on. And we only take on about 1 in 3 students, and that's really important for us, because if you're working with us, you're not a number, you're kind of an individual. We want to make sure that, one, you have the academic background to succeed, because we don't want to waste your time and money by taking you on, giving you hope. And secondly, if we do take you on, we want to make sure that you actually have sufficient preparation to get over the finish line, rather than a band-aid over a potential problem. So we do that this is why we do this. It's a fairly laborious process at times, because it does require quite a few calls and assessments. But the result at the end of it, what we can do is we can ensure that you or your child are going to have a good chance when you're working with us. So there's a few questions on the pricing of the programs as well. And what happens if they don't get asked for, if they don't get an interview at the end of it?
If they don't get an interview, okay. So yeah, again, in terms of the pricing, ultimately, what I recommend at the end of our conversations, it is going to vary pretty dramatically from student to student. And yeah, generally speaking, I much prefer to give you an accurate sense as to what you'll be doing and what it will cost, rather than a general sense. In terms of the refund, if you don't get an interview offer, it's likely that you'll have done the majority of, if not all of the interviews course by the time the offer comes along. Remember, you know, if you're one of the ones who gets 5 days notice, it would be pretty reckless of us to sort of hold back lots and lots of preparation until then. We're focused on making sure you can interview to the best of your ability. So our process will be to do the vast majority of that in advance. Preparing for the interviews is a bit of a gamble. You have to be prepared to take a bet on yourself and on your application. You know, if you're a Cambridge applicant, that's a pretty good bet. There are pretty good odds on that. If it's Oxford, then the bet is a more risky one. And of course, you know that there are some courses which interview only a small proportion of the people who apply. And again, in our conversation, we'll have a discussion about your strength of the overall application and whether or not, you know, it is a bet worth taking. But, you know, this is Oxford and Cambridge. It's certainly worth giving it your best shot. So yeah, long answer. We wouldn't refund at that point. We'd have done basically everything already.
Thanks, Will. There have been a couple of questions about unconditional offers. Now, if you've already got your A-level results, there isn't a condition for them to put on your offer. However, if you haven't done your A-levels yet, then yeah, you will have offer conditions to meet. Back in the olden days, they used to very rarely put out what were called matriculation offers, where they wanted you so much that they would give you an offer of, say, D, but that doesn't happen anymore. Unfortunately, if you haven't done your A-levels yet, you're going to have to do well in those as well, alongside the interview. There's a question about the weighting of the written work, especially for a subject like English. I have some new information about this that I can share with you, Divya, if you get in touch, which is a new piece of research I haven't shared with Rohan yet, which is exciting. So I've got some quite specific information there if you want to get in touch. I don't want to bore everyone else on the call with it because it's relatively complicated, but it'll be really interesting to chat about that if you have the opportunity.
So please do keep your questions coming in. We'll stay on for a little bit longer, but please also don't feel offended if we don't answer your question. It's not because we don't want to, it's we have a lot of them coming in. If we're not able to get through, then please do get in touch with us. Me and Will are working this weekend. We will be able to take on some of your inquiries and kind of help you kind of make a decision as to what the next steps are with your application. Every year we work with about 300 students, so we've still got some spaces to work with students, but more importantly, make sure that you take the time to actually analyze what the next steps are for the interview process. So,
yeah, we've had a few questions about being prepared for the interviews, whether you're going to get when you're sitting them remotely. We don't have as much information as we would like on those yet, particularly for the admissions tests. Like the Cambridge Law test, we know that that's going to be sent to students in the last week of November, and I expect the other tests will be following that same format. So probably those tests taking place at the end of this month before the interview. But yeah, we're keeping an eye out for any new confirmations there. There are quite a few questions about chances of getting in, statistical questions. Again, if you get in touch with us directly, I can grab those for you really quickly. as
It's
well.
worth also saying that Oxford better than Cambridge do a good job of, when you go on the course pages, they will give you the percentage asked to interview and the percentage accepted. And that can be a very helpful tool. You know, I certainly, I would never recommend a student come to us and not look at their course pages. You know, it's really important to do that search yourself, understand your subject, because you get a course outline, you get all the entry requirements. It's really helpful for students when they're early on in their process to actually know, this is what I want to do. Particularly for students who are sort of following on from subjects that they've done at school. You know, you want to make sure that actually the subject that you're doing at university is what you're expecting of it, because subjects can change quite dramatically. And it might be that, you know, you've really enjoyed geography at school, but geography at Oxford actually is quite different and not as good as some other geography courses, or not as good for you personally. That's always important to check.
One question here for you, Matt. Will the interviewers do stress interviews to see the reaction of candidates? It sounds like someone who's gone through the Oxbridge system in the days of old, potentially.
No, hopefully they're going to be behaving nicely towards all of the interviewees, given the difficult circumstances. My overall sense is that you wouldn't learn anything useful by trying to make someone upset, particularly over the internet. So hopefully that sort of thing won't be going on. But I have absolutely heard stories of that kind from the olden days. You know, to make, you know, the interviewer asks you to tell them a joke or something like that. My understanding is that sort of thing is rather frowned upon these days and doesn't tend to go on. But obviously, if you hear anything to the contrary, do let us know, because we're always keen to have the most up-to-date information we can.
A couple of questions. Oh, sorry, Matt.
Oh yeah, I'd a nice softball for you here, Rohan. Are there any no-nos for a medicine interview at Cambridge? Now, I believe there is one extremely specific one.
Okay, you're gonna have to tell me, because I can't read your mind at this point.
See, my recollection is that the one thing you have is that you mustn't say that you have an ethical objection to abortion, and that you would never help a patient who was looking for one. I believe there is an important regulatory thing there. Yeah,
so I mean, obviously, as you said, there are some ethical lines that you shouldn't cross. In my interviews, for example, and this is really topical, it came up. So I was asked, what would I do if I saw a patient who was unwell and on the 4th floor collapsed outside the hospital, and I'd just finished my shift, and therefore I wasn't insured. And actually, some applicants said, well, if I'm not insured, I'd kind of try and get extra help, or I'd look for other avenues, or potentially get them into the hospital to another doctor. The correct answer there was just to a certain extent a humanities test. I just said I'd help them, and, you know, forget about the insurance. There's no major no-nos. Obviously, there's things that you shouldn't be doing, and there's things you should be doing more of. As an example, saying I don't know constantly is probably not going to do you very many favors, but saying I don't know, however, could it be these 3 things, is a much better way of handling those questions. I suppose the only no-no is really having extremely strong ethical stances which are not believed, which aren't really compatible with medicine. So a few years ago, when I used to do interviews, I did have one student who didn't believe in cells. He just didn't believe that the cells existed. I think that's fundamentally incompatible with studying medicine, because if you don't believe in what you're studying, then eventually essentially you're learning things for the sake of it, which is not a good thing. So long-winded way of saying very few things are no-nos.
But yeah, where the problems come in, they tend to be on the ethical front rather than on the expertise front. So hopefully that's something that you've already got well under wraps at this stage of the application, that you're on the right ground ethically.
Got a few questions here on should I have prepared more for interviews by this point? What if I'm not started preparing at all, or is it too late to start preparing for interviews? What would you say to these students, Will?
So to a lot of students who have been coming to us in the last few weeks, or the last couple of weeks basically, I've told them actively put the interviews to one side for a moment, focus on the test, because that's the next biggest hurdle. But, you know, under the promise that once the test was done, they would then refocus and start working on the interviews properly. Now, students start preparing for the application process at all different times, whether they're doing it with school or on their own or with us. Students will, start at all different points. What's important is to make the most of the time when you start, okay? Whether you're starting a year in advance or 6 months or 2 weeks, you need to make the most of that time. That's really, really important. So now we've got 4 weeks, basically. I certainly wouldn't wait 2 weeks before deciding to get a move on. I would start thinking about and preparing for the interviews as soon as possible. So you've had a couple of days break from the test. That should be more than enough. And once you're done with the interviews, then you can have a very nice long break. But yeah, ideally, this isn't the first time you've thought about your Oxbridge interview. Ideally, you've put a bit of time into it already. But a month is a very long time if you use it correctly, not right. Of course, we have our own way of what we've found uses that time well, uses that time the best, and helps prepare students the most effectively in that time. And that's why we're recommending it at the moment. And again, the main thing which students say to me is that they want to wait for their interview invitation. I completely understand that. But I will always urge against it because it's just not sensible. You will not give yourself enough time.
Absolutely. And the thing to remember is these interviews, you're going to need these skills again in life, because unfortunately you're probably going to have to do a job interview, go on a first date, go to another job interview. These kinds of soft skills and curiosity and engaging with other people, ultimately you're going to need that for the rest of your life. And so even if you don't get the interview on this occasion, they'll stand you in good stead for the long run. I'm just having a look. Most of the questions are all about interview preparation that we've got left, and I think we've sort of talked about that in fairly general. If you've got subject-specific questions, again, do get in touch with us, as it's difficult for us to go through all of those. Indeed, we've had, I think, just about 120 questions today, which is a lot of questions, and so we're sorry we're not able to get to all of them.
We've got an interesting one saying, this is probably for you, Matt, will this year be more competitive from more applicants?
So our understanding is that there has been a small uptick in the number of applications made this year. I wouldn't be able to check the number immediately, but my understanding
I think it was about 14% uptick, but that included the medics as well. So
yes, a small uptick there. Now, the thing to remember is 14%, it might sound like a lot, but that does include a lot of people applying for medicine. And I think we can safely say that medicine has been in the public imagination this year, and that medicine is going to be something people are very interested in. So while there is an uptick there, I think it's unlikely that that's all Oxford and Cambridge, probably not even half of it. So I would say that the numbers are probably largely unchanged. The thing to say as well is even a 10% uptick in the number of applicants, that only has a 10% impact on the number of places at each course. And that actually, at the individual level, is a very small impact. That's the difference between a course going from 22% of people getting in to 20% of people getting in. And while that's something that you might notice at the population level if you're using a big spreadsheet, ultimately there's only one of you applying. And so that isn't going to affect an individual person.
There's also a question I noticed about being asked for additional interviews and what that means. Generally speaking, so often you are assigned additional interviews before you've had your first interview. Matt, you went out of the presentation for a bit. So you might go to your interview week knowing that you'll have one at Pembroke and one at Magdalen. If they ask you back, it probably means that they're still deciding about you, and they feel like they need to know a bit more before they can make a full decision. If you don't get asked back, I wouldn't spend time agonizing over it. Ultimately, you've done all you can. And the most sensible thing is just to try and forget about it. Try and enjoy the Christmas holidays as much as that's possible this year. And then when it comes around to January, hopefully you'll get some really good news. But again, it's similar with how we approach the tests. At this point, aside from the ones with the technical difficulties, there's very little you can do about the actual, sorry, my headphones just went out of battery. There's very little you can do about the test. And when you're finished with your interviews, there's very little you can do about it then. So it's not worth worrying, well, I got asked for an extra one, or I didn't get asked for an extra one. What does that mean?
Yeah, thanks, Will. We've had another question that we have a nice quick answer to. I have A-level results from this year, so that's the teacher assessed grades. Will they be less valued? No. As far as Oxford and Cambridge are concerned, they're just as good. And Oxford and Cambridge were at the very front of the campaign to make sure that students were given their teacher assessed grades. And so it would be strange for them not to give them equal weight. So no, those are absolutely fine, the teacher assessed grades. That won't be a problem at all.
Someone's applied to Christchurch.
Ah, you know all about this, Will. This is your alma mater.
Yes, so that's where I studied. I don't think it was a mistake. I think it's a pretty good college. And that's my unbiased professional opinion. Again, so lots of people pay lots of attention to this. And it's part of the wider talk about pooling. Generally speaking, if you're good enough for Oxford, you'll end up somewhere there, okay? Even if you maybe aren't good enough for the Christchurch pool that year just because it's oversubscribed with particularly talented people, just because by probability that will happen, doesn't mean that you won't be moved somewhere else. There will be other colleges which are less applied to, have fewer talented applicants that year, who will be keen for you if you are a good applicant, okay? So I really wouldn't worry about it. I would be more concerned about making sure that you are the best applicant you can be, because that is what is going to make the biggest difference compared to whether or not you apply to the right college.
Right.
Just this one, because I'm interested in it actually. Is it best to have a virtual background in the interview this year, Matt?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about that yet. I think the most important thing is to make sure that you're clearly visible, so you can engage the interviewer well. I would try it out, see if a virtual background works well for you, see if it doesn't. But bear in mind that the software they're using might not be Zoom, it might be Teams, it might be Bramble, it might be Skype, it could be anything, we don't know yet. And so you don't want to spend too much time preparing for Zoom and then it turned out not to be it. But that's not a bad idea, and if it's something that makes you feel more comfortable, then I would give it a go. Obviously, if you have a beautiful background that you can show off to the viewer, maybe you want to stick with that, but it's up to you, and just a case of making sure that you feel your best and most comfortable and most able to achieve in the interview.
I think we'll start wrapping up soon, but there's still quite a lot of questions coming through. Matt, while me and Will take the next few questions, would you mind just giving people a demonstration of how they can book a consult by just going onto the main website and just going through the booking system?
Yeah, let me just set that up for you now.
Sure, and Will, me and you can bash through some of these questions. So let's have a look.
So there have been a few about people in year 11 and year 12. For year 12 students, there are options to start preparing now. I'd recommend getting in touch with us and booking a consultation so that I can have a better chat with you about what would be the most sensible approach. But yeah, like I said earlier, there's no harm in preparing earlier. People will start at all different times, and if you're starting with the time advantage, it's best to make the most of that. Generally speaking, we find that the earlier a student starts preparing, the better they do. It's a pretty simple correlation that we see each year. Obviously, there's lots of other variables in there as well, but, and you know, a smart psychologist doesn't infer causation from correlation, but it's certainly worth playing things in your favor.
Do we have any chemistry tutors? So yeah, we've got tutors from pretty much every subject at Oxbridge, so archaeology to zoology and everything in between. And Matt's just showing you how to do the booking console with us on the screen as well. Ta-da. Well, what about year 11 students? We've got a couple here.
Yeah, so each year we typically take on several year 11 students and a handful of year 10 students as well. Very much it depends on you. You know, certain students fit well to long-term preparation, and certain students are really keen to get ahead and you know, start exploring their subject early. And absolutely, I recommend you get in touch and we can talk about how that would work. Obviously, I don't recommend a year 10 student start doing practice Bmat papers once a week. They'd be pretty sick of them pretty early on. But those soft skills that we talk about trying to develop in this last month for the interviews, if you're able to work on that over a year, that starts becoming second nature rather than something that you've had to learn quickly. Okay. And so certainly there are always things you can be working on. If you have a long-term plan from early on, you can be achieving milestones to make that and get that offer.
We've had a few questions about admissions tests. These are another area where it's good to get in touch directly. I have a lot of information on admissions test scoring that I can share with you directly, but it's not something that's straightforward to look up while I'm in the call because it's in like 9 different spreadsheets. But yes, people asking about NGAR and ELAT and Bmat scores, all that information I have and can share with you if you get in touch directly.
There's a lot of specific questions here, which I think would take us a little bit of time to go through in detail. So if we've not answered your question, it's likely because we need more information from you. And sometimes it can be a little bit painful to kind of go back and forth on the chat or in the Q&A. So please do get in touch with us. Particularly, there's been quite a few questions on international students. So we have to be very careful when giving advice for internationals because depending on even a small thing. So for instance, we've had some students who've said to us, we're taking the baccalaureate and they're applying from Spain. And they've omitted to mention it's not the international baccalaureate, but the Spanish baccalaureate. And those kind of small things can actually make a huge impact on your application. So we tend to not advise too much in detail about international applicants. So please do get in touch with us if you're in particular, if you're applying with unusual circumstances, if you're applying as a mature student, or if you're applying with unusual qualifications.
There's a question here about, as we are expecting a decrease in the number of places, do you have an estimate of how many places will be available at Cambridge for 2021, maybe for economics? Now, as far as I know, Cambridge has moved things around and adjusted things to make sure that there isn't a decrease in the number of places next year.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And so they've essentially taken on a much larger cohort this year to be able to take on the additional students who didn't miss their entry grades as they would have expected. So it shouldn't make an enormous difference, actually. It should follow similar trends to most other years.
There's my son to A-level university. Will, what would you say to that?
So obviously he doesn't have to have decided everything, bless you, Matt, from this point. You know, I certainly didn't have a clear sense as to what I wanted to study when I was in year 10. But the best thing to do at this point is he will have a few things that he likes doing. He will have a few things that he's interested in. what I really try to do with the younger students is to help them explore in these areas. Start them off with a broad curriculum which approaches a huge different variety of subjects. I've got lots of students in year 10 who tell me, I'm interested in law, but I'm also interested in engineering, and I'm also interested in medicine. I also like, geography. Young students often have a broad range of things that they're really keen on and interested in. And what's really important now is not to choose one route and sort of funnel them into it, but let them explore all these different routes properly. That example I gave of a student who's interested in loads of different things likely doesn't really know much about what law is like at university or what law is like as a profession, but likes the idea of it. So it's important for them to explore it properly, really get to understand the different topics, not just the law that they see on TV, but actually have a good understanding of what law is like as an academic pursuit and also as a profession, and explore these things for all different subjects. And at the end of it, I think you'll find that your son is able to make a pretty good decision as to what he enjoys. I often use the example of maths, because lots of people who like maths don't like maths at university. They're much more suited to engineering because they much prefer the practical side of maths rather than the more theoretical side, which university maths often becomes. But if you don't know that going into it, you can end up choosing a course that isn't right for you. A lot of our year 10 students, we have these things called Enrichment Seminars, which run each week, and they're university level seminars and discussions about all these different topics. And I usually tell our younger students to just pick and choose each week which one they want to come to, so that they can really explore what they're interested in.
I think probably that's the best to wrap things up. As I can see, we've still got a lot of questions. Again, if you can reach out to us directly, unless there's a couple there you Rohan, or will want to pick out now before we disappear.
No, I think kind of gone through the ones that don't require significant information and back and forth. Just to say, please don't leave it till, regardless of whether you work with us or someone else, or want to do it completely on your own. Please don't leave it till too late. Start preparing now. The interview invites will come out quicker than you realize, and actually, based on our experience, it wouldn't be unusual for Oxford and Cambridge to give you less than a week's notice, especially if the interview is happening remotely. So really take the bull by the horns and make sure you're the early bird rather than kind of waiting around.
Absolutely. Right. Well, that just leaves me to say thank you, Will, for coming and helping out on a Saturday.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Rohan, as well. Again, I understand you're both free to answer calls and set up consultations over the next couple of days. So hopefully you'll all be speaking to Will and Rohan over the coming days. And if you have any particular queries, do email us, and one of us will get back to you, particularly if it's a statistical researchy test question, which hopefully I'll be able to answer for you. But yeah, thank you, everyone. We've held on to more than half of you for an hour and a half now, which is pretty spectacular. So yeah, thank you all for coming, and we look forward to hearing from you.
If we don't, best of luck with the interviews.
Yes, of course. Yeah, as Rohan said, we like to give as much information as we can so that everyone sort of has as good a chance as they can do whether they work with us or not. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.